Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Chapter 1130 kicks off our official start to the Elbaf arc, and there's so much to talk about between Vivi's message, the Giants' bounties, the political climate of Elbaf, and so much more, and I want to get into it right away. But first, I should briefly touch on the Yamato cover story. There's nothing too eventful this week as we find Yamato and Tama resting in Amigasa village. On top of the various abductions going around, it seems someone has come to steal Yasue's sword. It's not certain if this is actually the same person behind those abductions, but what I think we can glean from this development is that the person stealing the sword may not be a Wano native, or at the very least, not someone who buys into the code of honor of the samurai, as we know stealing a sword is a great crime. That may help narrow down the potential suspects a little bit, perhaps one of the remaining beast pirates on the island, but we'll just have to see. That said, without further ado, let's jump into chapter 1130, The Accursed Prince. We pick things up revisiting the other half of the crew as we find them coming to the end of their search for the rest of the Straw Hats and the Thousand Sunny. This comes as quite a surprise to the Giants, prompting Dory and Broggy to strike a classic pose that you often see in Japanese media when a character is taken aback. In fact, Broggy was last seen in this pose toward the end of the Little Garden arc when Dory suddenly arose after having been thought to be dead. We learn that they've already made quite the effort to no avail, even exhausting the fish in the area thanks to Jinbei's ability to communicate with sharks. The crew is confident that the rest of the Straw Hats are alive and fine as they believe in each other's strengths, a sentiment that we've seen time and time again in the series, especially when these kinds of separations occur. And with this, the Giants' ship set sail for Elbaf once again, suggesting that they may have actually gone off course or retraced their movements in hopes of looking for their missing Straw Hat companions. A bit later in the chapter, this half of the crew catches up on some of the news. While they do mention that they are reading today's morning paper, I wonder if this was actually distributed to them this morning, or if this is just something they picked up across the 2 days that they were asleep, as we tend to see the news get reported during the very next day of the event. Either way, there's a lot to talk about with this newspaper in particular, so let's jump in. First and foremost, Broggy mentions that he can't read as it's too small for him. Now, the Giants' ability to consume world events through newspaper is probably something you've thought about before at some point, and I'm glad that Oda actually addresses it to some extent here, though I do find it a bit strange considering that Dory and Broggy referenced the newspaper from a few days ago as having been what prompted them to head for Egghead to save Luffy. That said, I wouldn't consider this a true contradiction really, as there's plenty of ways to account for this, such as some member of the Red Hair Pirates or their Grand Fleet having been around to read them this news. Now, we learned that Dory and Broggy have received updated wanted posters after having been blamed for destroying Egghead alongside Luffy. We'd first seen their original wanted posters from 100 years ago, all the way back during the Little Garden arc. Their last recorded bounties were 100 million berry, as the two disappeared from the world for a century thanks to their duel on Little Garden. Oda addresses another long speculated belief among the fandom here by including the existence of inflation with respect to their bounties. Over time, the value of money changes based on various factors, and here, it seems 100 million berry from a century ago goes a lot further in the present day. Now, it's not totally clear what the equivalency would be, as it's possible their bounties were also further increased from the actions they took on Egghead. Either way, a 1.7 billion berry increase is one of the highest increases we've seen in the series, just falling short of Crocodile, who recently had a 1.8 billion increase himself. And for some more context, Dory and Broggy's bounties are now just under Crocodile's and just above Boa Hancock's. This gives the Giant Warrior Pirate captains some of the highest active bounties in the series. There's no mention of the Straw Hat bounties in this chapter, and it's not totally clear if that's because Oda is holding off on that event for later, or if they just did not get an increase this time around. After all, the events of Wano were not too long ago, and at a certain point, increasing bounties yields diminishing returns. The Straw Hats are already some of the most wanted pirates on all of the seas. Now, despite this, Luffy does end up getting blamed for the death of Vegapunk. We had a suspicion this was going to happen as Egghead progressed, and this headline specifically was among the stories that Morgans wished to report on as we saw at the end of the arc. Jinbei and Brook discuss how it could be possible for the World Economic Journal to have ended up with this picture of Luffy. Now, as we saw during the Wano arc, Morgan seems to have informants and sources in different facets of the world. Scratchman Apu was shown to be relaying scoops to him during the raid on Onigashima, and it appears the CP0 agent Guernica was able to get a photo of Luffy in Gear 5th over to Morgan's before he died. Now, Luffy did use Gear 5th multiple times throughout the Egghead arc, so there were plenty of opportunities for this picture to have been taken. So the real question is, who took it? It could have been some rogue unnamed Marine or world government agent at any given point, but I have to wonder if whoever sent this photo to Morgan's was also the person who first informed him of the world government's plans to assassinate Vegapunk and Luffy's presence on Egghead. I've talked about this on the channel for a while now, and it still has yet to be addressed. The scoop was not something lobbed to him by the world government themselves, as he's the one who decides to spin it. If it were, they would not be giving him the whole truth. So this had to be someone who was both aware of Luffy's presence on the island and the world government's grand plan. I've long suspected this mysterious informant to be Stussy, as we know from her V-Ray card and the events of the Whole Cake Island arc that she has exchanged intel with Morgans for quite a while now, and I wouldn't be surprised if she ends up heading to him now that her cover is blown. It could have been Stussy who sent this photo of Luffy to Morgans, especially since she knows that Morgans has some vested interest in him as a pirate, on top of Morgans having some potential further awareness of what Luffy's appearance in Gear 5th might mean. All of that said, it doesn't necessarily have to be anyone in particular, as we do know that the Marines have employees who specialize in this kind of thing. Though the one Marine photographer we know of, Atach or Atachan, no longer works for them and instead gained deployment from Morgans. His current status, however, is unknown, as he was at some point replaced by a Saferpol agent. The real Atach could be out there doing fieldwork for Morgans, but whoever it is that took this picture of Luffy is unlikely to have been fully loyal to the world government, as we know they did not want his appearance in this form spread across the world. Speaking of his appearance, something is a bit off here, as Robin notices a vaguely familiar symbol on his left forearm. This probably set off alarm bells in your brain, as this is clearly the iconic X mark that the Straw Hats used during the Alabasta arc to prove their friendship and loyalty to one another in the face of their enemies. We had been wondering if there was any significance to the certain configuration of the Straw Hats being separated, what with the 6 most tenured members on Elbaf and the 4 newest members being here on the ship. I had been speculating that this may be some indication that we will be working towards a reunion with Vivi, and with the Straw Hats she worked with during the Alabasta saga being removed from the picture, it would create a fun opportunity for her to have met the rest of the crew. And it seems we're getting something along those lines here, as Robin, Frankie, Brooke, and Jinbei, all having joined after the events of Alabasta, would not understand the significance of this symbol. Robin does remark that it feels familiar, and that's likely because she had stowed away on the Going Merry while the Straw Hats were signaling goodbye to Vivi. It's possible that she overheard or saw this symbol at some point, but never really put too much thought into it. Now, some folks may wonder if there is something special going on with Luffy's abilities, as if he's manifesting the symbol on his arm from his subconscious, and there is a fun connection here, as we saw Emmett bear an X or a cross on his forearms as well during the flashback with Joy Boy at the tail end of the Egghead arc, but I don't think there's anything mystical going on. Instead, this feels like this is Vivi's attempt at communicating a message to the Straw Hats. Oda goes out of his way to include Robin's observation that the picture of his arm is blurry, but the X is clear. This would suggest that this X was overlaid on top of a lower resolution image, and it seems Vivi is attempting to convey to the Straw Hats her current status, as it would be reasonable for them to think that she is with the World Economic Journal, given that she was able to get this edit into print. Not only that, but it may also mean that Vivi is looking to reunite with them once again. At the start of the Egghead arc, half the crew wanted to find Vivi and save her after having learned that she had gone missing, but it was eventually settled that they would act once they had a better idea of the situation. Now with Vivi signaling to the Straw Hats, it may be time for their reunion. I should also note that this is not the first time that we've seen a Straw Hat or a Straw Hat affiliate use a message on a limb to communicate with the rest of the crew, as this is very reminiscent of Luffy's 3D2Y message toward the end of the pre-time skip. The big news drops don't stop there though, as the giant warrior pirates paint a better picture of just what may be the main conflict of the Elbaf arc. Throughout these panels are of course Dory, Brogy, Oimo, and Kashi, but we've also gotten more of the recurring cast of giants that we saw throughout Egghead. Also earlier, when discussing Dory and Brogy's bounty increase, we saw the full design of that large chin giant from a few chapters ago. Brogy brings up Hiruden being a member of the Straw Hats' Grand Fleet when Kashi reveals to us that Hiruden is the son of the king. This is a pretty big bombshell, but we actually might have had some reason to suspect that Hiruden had the claim to the throne all the way back upon his introduction. There, he stated that he was competing for the Flame Fruit so he could use its power to become the king of the giants. At the time, it was very easy for us to just read this as if it was a riff on Luffy's dream of being king of the pirates, but in hindsight, it makes perfect sense that he needed some claim to the throne in order to do so. This would make Hiruden a prince as well, and perhaps even a brother to the Prince Loki that we first heard of back during Whole Cake Island, but it's not entirely clear if these two are proper siblings. In fact, there's a bit more to suggest that Hiruden may be the illegitimate child of the king. Now, Hyrule had actually wanted to come to the Straw Hat's aid on Egghead himself, which would have made good on those Grand Fleet theories that we all had all those months ago, but he was made to stay behind as someone needed to make sure Elbaf was safe. As it turns out, Prince Loki, who we first heard of all the way back during Whole Cake Island, is the shame of the nation. At some point within the last 63 years, he committed patricide and murdered his own father in order to acquire the power of a legendary devil fruit that was passed from generation to generation within the royal family. Loki killing his father is an incredibly shameful act in the face of Elbaf culture, as we know that they believe you are defined by how you die, so King Harold being murdered outside of battle would surely bring a great shame upon the nation. Now, Jinbei expresses some familiarity with Loki, which makes sense given his time with the Big Mom Pirates. There's just a whole lot to sink our teeth into with this, so let's start with Hyrule and Loki's relationship. It's not completely clear from the wording of this chapter if these two are meant to be siblings. We learn Loki's father was King Harold, but it's not necessarily clear if this was also Hyruden's father. Though I suspect this may be the case, given that if the current king was the father of Hyrule, there would not really be any need for Hyrule to prove his strength in order to become the current king, as it would likely just be passed down to him. Instead, it seems to me that Hyrule and Loki may be half-brothers, where they both share a father but have different mothers. Typically, the eldest child would have the first claim to the throne, and we know Hyrule is 18 years older than Loki, as Loki was only born around 63 years ago. Despite this, Hyrule has been portrayed as needing to claim the throne by force rather than simply inheriting the title. This could be because Loki, despite being younger than him, was born to the queen, making him the rightful heir to the throne. It's also of note that during Big Mom's flashback, we are told that Loki was born at the castle, which we seem to get a glimpse of later on in this chapter. I'll get more into the geography and layout of Elbaf as an island toward the end of the breakdown, but for the purposes of this discussion, it's clear that Elbaf is stratified across at least 2 levels. Everything we've seen of the island so far in the series has taken place in the lower realm, while the upper realm seems to be where the aforementioned castle is located, and it's perhaps where those of a higher status live. During Big Mom's flashback, we see Hyrule in an Elbaf village, likely in the lower realm given the surroundings amongst warriors and common folk. This does not seem to be any place for royalty, and in fact, the closest thing to a governing authority that we see in this village are the former elder captains of the giant warrior pirates, Jarl and Yorl. When we meet a young Hyrule here, he's being trained by Raideen, who reminds him that he is a warrior. While it would make sense for even the royalty of Elbaf to be known as warriors, given what we see in the rest of the flashback, it seems as if Hyrule was actually living in this village, while Loki was said to have lived in the castle. Now, up until this point, all we knew about Loki was that he had fallen in love with Lola and had been hoping to take her hand in marriage despite the decades of animosity between the giants of Elbaf and Big Mom. Presumably, this was before he killed King Harold and was imprisoned for his crimes. Given that Lola is 26 years old, we can narrow that time frame down quite a bit. Lola had gotten her shadow stolen by Gecko Moria around 5 years ago, meaning she had to have rejected Loki at least 5 years prior to present day. Pudding was meant to be married off to the Vinsmoke family when she was only around 16 years old, so I suspect that we can use that age as a lower range for how old Lola must have been when she rejected Loki's proposal, so that means this must have happened as far back as around 10 years prior, but not within the last 5 years. And this would work with the brief scene that we saw between Pudding and Lola when the latter was preparing to set sail to find a husband of her own. In that original silhouette of Loki, he is shown having the support of the other giants, but this somewhat contradicts the testimonies of him being the shame of Elbaf. As we saw during the Big Mom's flashback, the people of the Elbaf village did not seem to have any hatred for the newborn Loki. Plus, we saw Loki was surrounded by cheerful giants when he proposed to Lola. Because of this, it seems plausible that the disdain for Loki only came after he was rejected and turned to commit the various evil acts. Now, it's unclear if this fruit that belonged to the royal family was passed down as a physical object to be guarded by each generation, or if the fruit was actually consumed by the king of each generation. The latter case is a bit more interesting, as it would suggest that the Elbaf giants know of some way to transfer devil fruit powers without the fruit going back into circulation. We've actually seen this a few times in the series before, with Big Mom acquiring her Soul fruit after seemingly having eaten Mother Carmel, or famously with Blackbeard acquiring Whitebeard's Quake fruit by some unspecified means. Now, I'm not sure if Oda is willing to explicitly tread down the cannibalism path here, but I'm curious to see where exactly he goes. Now, as for what exactly this devil fruit is, I feel like any guess is just as good at this point. There's been a certain trend toward mythical zones in the series as of late, so I would think that to be the most likely path here, but I would also love a cool new Paramecia, or perhaps even a Logia. After all, Hyrule did mention how the Flame fruit would allow him to become king of the giants, so perhaps there's something to that. Some part of me wonders though, if Loki was even able to eat the fruit, or how how much is actually the truth that's being told here? They say Loki being unleashed will bring a ruin to the entire world, so if he already had these powers before he was captured, it seems odd that he was able to be subdued. There could be some slight propaganda or exaggeration going on to make Loki out to be a bigger threat. In such a scenario, there is a fun thought that comes to mind with what Loki says at the end of this chapter. In the case that Loki did not end up acquiring the power, could this fruit that has been passed down through the generations actually have been the fruit that was eaten by Luffy? As we know, the Gum Gum fruit has escaped the world government's grasp for hundreds of years, having most recently been in their clutches around 13 years ago. The reason the world government was unable to get their hands on the fruit throughout the centuries could have been that it was under the protection of the Elbaf royals, and with King Harold's death, the fruit may have returned to circulation, leaving Elbaf's borders and allowing the world government to finally come across it. We've long speculated that Joy Boy or even Nika may have been a giant, and I've even often wondered if Elbaf was the remnants of the ancient kingdom. This theory may be a bit far-fetched and may even feel a little forced in terms of placing even more importance on the already incredibly important Gum Gum fruit, but it could end up working out. It would explain why Loki believes himself to be a sun god, as he sees himself the rightful owner of the fruit. This is all just good speculation here though, and there's a lot of fun possibilities at play, so I'm interested in hearing what you think the fruit may be. Be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments. The penultimate spread of this chapter gives us our first look at Prince Loki himself, as we find him chained up to the base of what appears to be the giant tree at the center of the island. His design is incredible and imposing, and actually reminds me a lot of Doflamingo. The two characters share a lot of similarities, with both of them being disgraced royals who have killed their fathers and are currently imprisoned for their sins. They both have covered up eyes and their tongues stick out, etc, etc. But regardless, there are a ton of interesting aspects to his design, from the wingspan-like tattoo across his chest, the skull on his belt with a 3-point crown, reminiscent of how he was actually depicted in his initial silhouette, to the giant hammer on his back, perhaps being a reference to Thor's Mjolnir. The more interesting part to me at the moment, however, is that his eyes seem to be bandaged up. This could be for a plethora of reasons, from being part of his imprisonment, or even being a reference to some Norse mythology where Loki is blinded. It may even have to do with his devil fruit powers, perhaps relying on sight to make use of them, as we do see the shape of his eyes toward the end of the chapter, perhaps even being shown glowing. Though, if he does have powers, I'd imagine the chains to be made of sea stone to prevent him from using them. Or maybe this is a way of limiting his potential conqueror's haki, as Luffy does sense his presence at the start of the chapter. Interestingly, it seems Zoro doesn't necessarily pick up on it himself, despite us knowing that he and Sanji are proficient enough at observation haki to sense someone's haki like this, which may even suggest that there's something greater going on here with the voice of all things. This would not be the first time that Luffy noticed someone communicating with the voice of all things while others didn't, with the most recent instance actually being just several chapters ago, as Luffy spoke with Emmett. I also think it's possible that Loki is actually blind, and that Oda is perhaps conflating his character with Hoder, who is also a blind son of Odin. Perhaps Loki is just a mix of all of Odin's children, given Thor's hammer on his backside. Now, Loki being unable to see would also provide a lot of interesting context for his love for Lola. Without getting unnecessarily hateful here, Lola was not made out to be a traditionally attractive character, so perhaps what Loki fell for was not actually her appearance, but her heart. This would explain why he was able to discern that he was being tricked when Chiffon replaced Lola. If Loki is blind, it's somewhat funny that it was said to be love at first sight, and I could totally see a world where he cannot see, but instead uses his voice of all things to pick up on his surroundings. But the most interesting part of Loki's reveal here is that he believes himself to be the sun god, one who brings the world to its end. This is of course directly in contrast to everything we've learned about the sun god so far, as Nika has been portrayed as a savior figure. Of note, Loki does use the phrase Taiyo no Kami for sun god here, which is in line with every other mention of the deity, aside from Rodo's usage in the past few chapters. He called himself the sun god using Taiyo Shin, which to me played into the whole artificial nature of Rodo's operation, just further cementing him as a false god, a wannabe. Whereas here, it seems Loki is actually convinced that he himself is the sun god. Now, given everything so far, I have to wonder if the gods of Elbaf that we've seen referenced before are not actual mythical beings, but real people who once gained the title of god. Rodo and Loki are not the first Elbaf giants we've seen to use this notion of god to prescribe a certain status upon an individual. Back during Big Mom's flashback, the Elder Chiefs described her as a god of destruction. And of course, we have the scene where Carmel used her knowledge of Elbaf culture to ascribe Pandora with the title Sun God as well. Back during Little Garden, we learned that there is a god of war named Elbaf, which may have actually been in reference to the original founder or ruler of this nation. And to be fair, we've seen the similar naming convention outside of Elbaf as well, as Ryuma was referred to as the god of the blade, and in the original Japanese texts, Chaka and Pel referred to as guardian gods of Alabasta. Of course, there's other examples, such as the Sky People referring to their leader as God, or even Usopp being granted that title upon saving the prisoners of Dressrosa, and of course, the Celestial Dragons, who also refer to themselves as gods as well. If Roto was attempting to create a microcosm of Elbaf with himself as the ruler, the false sun god, then it could be that this little land of gods that he created is actually a hint at the much larger land of gods that is Elbaf. And with that, finally, let's talk about the nation itself. We've seen Elbaf in bits and pieces before, with our best look having been during Big Mom's flashback. There, we got to see the coast of the island, as well as the Elbaf village that she inhabited before being forced to leave. More recently, we actually got another look at the coast of the island with Shanks and his fleet docked nearby. The anime expounded upon this sequence and gave us a better look at the snow-capped mountains that were present inland while the surrounding areas were free from the wintry climate. And that's a bit interesting, as Elbaf does not necessarily seem to be a winter island, but just features a cold, icy middle section. This is in direct contrast to something like Egghead, where it was a winter island that was converted to a warmer climate thanks to the island AC. But the surrounding seas there were still subject to wintry weather, whereas Elbaf's surrounding waters seem fairly warm. Though we have seen the weather conditions in these areas can change, as we saw the coast experience snowfall during Big Mom's flashback. The Straw Hats find themselves exiting a large castle with a rope bridge connected to what we learn later on that this is the upper half of the island. I should note that this castle is quite reminiscent of what we saw in the Lego Village, with Big Steen Castle being elevated in a similar fashion. Chopper also mentions later on how he has experience with running across a rope, a reference to how he would get from the village area of Drum Island to the castle atop the mountains. Now, underneath the bridge in the forested area are giant wolves, very reminiscent of the army wolves that we saw in Impel Down's Freezing Hell. It's in the surrounding area of the castle that we meet Gerd and Goldberg, two fellow crewmates of the Giant Warrior Pirates, and it seems they're not so fond of Roto and his weird behavior either, as they go to confront him about sneaking outsiders into the country. They mention that they'll inform Chief Jarl about this, who we learn is still alive, making him just over 400 years old. It makes sense that Elbaf has a strict policy against outsiders, especially after having been brought to ruin by the arrival of a young Big Mom all those years ago. Now, the final spread of this chapter features the near entirety of Elbaf in all of its glory, and there's quite a bit to talk about here. As mentioned earlier, it would seem this island is stratified across a few levels, with the lower realm being where we have seen the most throughout the series, and the upper realm being what looks to be where the castle where Loki was born resides. The actual scale of everything is insane when you consider that these jagged figures at the bottom are entire mountains in their own right. The upper level seems to feature what may be the castle where Loki was born, and this entire area could just be where the royals live altogether, but it's important to note that Goldberg and Gerd actually came down from this bridge, suggesting that Hyrule may have now been welcomed in this area given the current political climate of the island. With Loki being a disgraced prince, they may now turn to Hyrule as their next potential ruler. This area also looks to be surrounded with cannons all around, really playing to the concept of it being an island known for war. There's also a gigantic sword that sticks out from the back. This is of course reminiscent of the giant blade that we saw in Onigashima, but this one is clearly much bigger as it spans almost the entirety of the island. While it was possible for the giant sword on Onigashima to have been used by an ancient giant, this sword here must have been wielded by someone at least the size of this island. In the back, you can also make out what looks to be rainbows. Now, we did see rainbows form when giants cried as far back as Little Garden, but it seems these are actually the result of these streams of water falling down from the uppermost layers of leaves. It would appear these waterfalls are actually the mysterious draping figures that we've seen throughout the years that many fans maybe speculated were dangling vines or branches. The question here is just what is it that is prompting this water to fall down like this? Given its height, I could see there being some mechanism at play that draws water from the very clouds in the sky itself, but I think it's incredibly curious that Oda decided not to show us the very top of the island. Fans have long speculated that Elbaf would resemble Yggdrasil and have multiple different layers or levels, so only seeing two so far may be a bit disappointing. However, I think we have reason to suspect that there's something else at the very top of the tree that Oda is saving for in a future development. Perhaps there will be the source of this mysterious water, or there's more to see. There's a ton of possibilities at play here, with this tree perhaps even being the Jewel Tree Atom that we've heard so much about, but that's about everything that I wanted to bring up in this video. We're off to an incredible start to the Elbaf arc, and I can't wait to see what we get next. Let me know all of your thoughts about the chapter down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.